Good evening. My name is Sally Allen, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of the Ann Arbor area. I welcome you to our online forum featuring candidates for the Ann Arbor City Council, Ward 3. The candidates will be on the ballot in the primary election on Tuesday, August 4th. This year, the League of Women Voters is celebrating 100 years of expanding voter rights, educating voters, and shaping and influencing legislation at local, state, and national levels. We are pleased to sponsor these forums. The League is a nonpartisan civic organization that encourages informed and active participation by all citizens in government. The League works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and seeks to strengthen and broaden knowledge about our form of government and democracy. While the League does not support candidates or parties, we do take stands on issues we have studied. One of the League's most important goals is to assist voters in making informed choices at the polls, and thus we bring you tonight's program. Our moderator this evening is Peter Allen, who will explain the format and get us started. Peter?
Thank you, Sally. And now it's my honor to introduce the three candidates running for Ann Arbor City Council Ward 3. Tony Brown, Travis Redina, and Evan Redmond. Thank you, candidates, for participating in this evening's forum. The forum tonight will have this format. Each candidate will have an opening statement of up to 1 minute. Each candidate will have a closing statement at the end of 90 seconds. In between, I will ask questions which came from the Ann Arbor community. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to their question. At appropriate times, a sign on the screen will indicate the time remaining, 30 seconds, and then stop. If you've used up your time, you will be allowed to finish your sentence, and then your microphone will be muted so the other candidates have an equal opportunity to participate. The candidates will begin speaking in alphabetical order. Depending on the number of questions, all candidates will have an opportunity to be the first or last to answer their question. We're now ready for the opening statement from Mr. Brown.
My thanks to the League and the folks watching this evening. The first thing I need folks to remember about me this day, on this 100th anniversary of the Women's League of Voters, is that I'm not a political insider. I'm an Ann Arbor insider, and I'm as Ann Arbor as you get. I'm the only candidate in this race who was raised in Ward 3. I've lived in Ward 3 for decades. I'm a public radio journalist. I've worked at WUOM, and I'm currently the digital distribution manager at WDET. I like to tell people the truth for a living. That's what my strengths are. For starters, my public engagement and my communication skills are what my campaign issues are. My issues are your issues, Ann Arbor. Affordable housing, taxes, neighborhood, environmental equity for all. And if elected, I'll be there to report to you, serve to you, and help shape public policy based on what you have to say. If you have any questions about me, please visit my website. Thank you.
And now, Mr. Redina, may we have your opening statement?
Good evening. I'm Travis Redina, a resident of the Arbor Oaks Bryant neighborhood, and I'm running for City Council because Ann Arbor residents pay for and deserve better than basic public services, because access to clean drinking water should be a basic human right, and because we're in the midst of a housing and affordability crisis that is threatening our city's future. I'm running to help achieve our ambitious carbon neutrality goals, to expand on our city's long history of leadership on human and civil rights, and to ensure that City Council is responsive, accessible, and transparent. But most importantly, well for the people. I'm invested in our community and in improving the lives of our neighbors. I look forward to the conversation tonight, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share more of my ideas with you. Thank you.
And finally, may we have your opening statement, Mr. Redmond?
Thank you very much to the League of Women Voters for hosting this event. The reason I'm running is that leadership in our city has failed to address the core systemic problems that limit Ann Arbor's diversity, accessibility, and long-term survivability. After the death of Ara Rosser at the hands of the Ann Arbor Police Department in 2014, City Council declared a police oversight emergency. Leadership installed an independent community police oversight commission that has no authority to regulate the police and used it as an excuse to increase the police budget. In 2015, City Council declared an affordable housing emergency with the original goal of adding 420 units of affordable housing each year. The goal has since been reduced to 150 units annually, and the city is unable to even provide that reduced amount. Then in 2019, the City Council declared a climate emergency. They commissioned the A20 plan to fight climate change, but almost rejected the proposal. We need leaders who will actually lead on important issues, and I hope to talk more about these tonight.
Peter, you're still muted.
Thank you, candidates. And now to the questions. As a reminder, I'll be reading the question once. It will not be repeated unless requested. To begin, we'll start with Mr. Redina. The questions that we received from the community members fall into several categories. Some have been around for a long time: housing, affordability, gentrification, and environment. And some, based on recent events, have definitely now come to the forefront: racial justice, diversity, inclusion, safety and police reform, city budget challenges due to the pandemic. So, Mr. Redina, here's question number one. In which of these areas do you think you are most passionate and most capable of making a difference?
Thank you. That's a great question, and obviously a really big one. All of those issues are things that are coming up frequently as I'm talking to voters throughout the 3rd Ward. I think the thing that comes up most frequently and that I have a lot of experience in is, frankly, the ability for residents to not only access members of City Council, but for council to be responsive to them, for council to be transparent and open in their work. In my experience as a constituent services director and later as a legislative director in the Michigan House of Representatives, it was our primary responsibility to make sure that we were always working toward the needs of the residents that we represented. And so I think that if I'm elected, my basic responsibility will be to show up, to be responsive, to be accessible, and to make sure that the residents of my ward are being heard. It's a key problem that I think residents all across Ward 3 feel right now, and I hope to use my experience to bring some of that responsiveness and accessibility to them. More importantly, one of the things that I also want to talk about is kind of some of the process that the Ann Arbor City Council currently has. Our meetings start at 7 o'clock in the evening and often run well into the night. The last meeting, I think, ran until after 3 a.m. Frankly, when things like that happen, it's not transparent, it's not accessible to the public. We need to make sure that the way that we're doing business is reflective of the ability for the public to have oversight in the work that council is doing. And so if I'm elected, I will focus on issues like transparency and accountability. I will make sure that I am responsive to the needs of the residents that I would represent. And I will make sure that council is doing business when the people can expect to be engaged and not when they're home asleep at night. Thanks.
And Mr. Redmond.
Thank you very much for this question. These are the 3 main planks of my platform, so it's going to be a little difficult to choose between them: the environment, affordable housing, and police oversight. But part of the reason why I'm running for city council is the fact that all of these have to be done through working in governance. The role of government, in my view, is to be able to push back against the status quo. In the case of the environment, pushing back against the status quo of fossil fuel industry and energy monopolies. In the case of affordable housing, is ensuring that all of our residents are able to live within the city, and even the people that would like to live within our city are able to do so even with modest means. They should not be excluded based on how much money they make every year. And police oversight. As an extension of local government, Ann Arbor has done a poor job of facilitating oversight. Right now, they have not been able to stand up to the state police unions who are stopping police reform at all turns, and we should take some of the money from the local police department and spend it towards these other issues. And a big thing that we need right now is funding, especially funding for climate change and funding for affordable housing. No matter how hard we work on these issues, if we don't have the funding to address them, we will not be able to get anything done. So unfortunately, I cannot quite answer your question on which of these I'm most passionate about. I have to say they're all incredibly important to me, and I will stay laser focused on these if elected.
And Mr. Brown.
Yeah, that is a very unique question. But first of all, you have to attack this question two-pronged. Where Ann Arbor has been, where it is now, and where we want to be in the future. Okay, so you look at climate control. That's something we should have been doing, as I say, yesterday. You take affordable housing. We have not been doing affordable housing properly. We have an issue there. We need to, first of all, attack that issue. So I think all of these issues you're talking about can be laser focused and dialed in, and there's certain things we can do to move the city forward as one. So the first of all, we have to control and maintain our infrastructure. So of course we know that we're going to be looking at a $16 million plus deficit in our budget. The first things we need to do is preserve our parks, preserve our infrastructure, get a hold of development and start doing development right. It's not how we develop, it's not, excuse me, check that, let me do this better than this. It's not how we or where we build, it's building right. So we need to start building right. Things like requiring solar panels on homes, okay? Or at least requiring that if a home is built or a property is built, long-term that house can be easily maintained or turned into a solar power home. There are little bitty steps we can do. And also from the IT standpoint, we'll need to reach out and connect with our fellow neighbors and lay out plans on how we will implement a lot of these programs long-term with the 820 plan and climate change. Climate change and building kind of go hand in hand if you think about it, when you think about where you're going to build and the effects of when you tear down a tree or you build something next to a freeway, what are going to be the repercussions of that? So you have to take it where you've been, where you are now, and where you want to be, and just think about it creatively. And all these things can all come into play if we all work together and have respect for each other's ideas. I think we can do it all. I think things are going to be tough, but if we come together, we can get to where we want to be as a city.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Next question starting with Mr. Redmond. Daily headlines are getting worse regarding COVID-19. Ann Arbor will be experiencing a significant drop in city revenue. What areas within the budget do you think you could offer significant savings, but that do not seriously compromise important programs and services?
Yes, so when I started off my campaign, I had what at the time was considered a controversial opinion, which was that we should begin to slowly defund the Ann Arbor Police Department. And through the mass protests that have occurred all across the nation, the renewed interest in police abolition with more community engagement instead, and the wanting to fund and fix the sources of systemic poverty and crime within our communities, I believe that we can make up for a good amount of this budget by taking funds from the Ann Arbor Police Department and moving it into the general fund. In my mind, someone who stops you for a traffic violation, writes you a noise complaint, respond to a domestic disturbance and someone stopping an active shooter should not all be the same job description. Police are overused, overtaxed, and overarmed. So we can begin to slowly defund the police department, move it into our continued community service. When the economy recovers, we can begin to use it for better public services. And I believe that is a huge budget of $30 million right now that could be spent on better things in our community.
Thank you, Mr. Redmond. Mr. Brown.
As I said before, you have to preserve, you have to fix your roads, you have to protect your water, and you have to protect your parks. It's pretty easy for me. There are a lot of places that we can go. We're not going to cut mental health. I'm still not on board with cutting money from the police department. I think money can be moved around there. But then when I asked this question here to the people in my neighborhood just yesterday, when we were up on Washtenaw, and we were looking at all this traffic and all this new development right there up in front of Falsettas, we still asked the question, why aren't the roads fixed on Pittsfield? So that can tip you off to where we're headed here in my side of the woods, is we'd like to see more of that money instead of some of those fancy projects out there on Washtenaw. We would like to see some of that money filter down and just protect our infrastructure on our private roads. So I think we would be moving some of that money around to protect the infrastructure, especially in these times. And when we talk about COVID-19, you're talking about something that's dear to me. I've lost 7 people due to COVID-19, and 5 of these are family members for senseless reasons. So all hands on deck when it comes to COVID-19. Everyone's going to face challenges. At every level of government and every type of home in Ann Arbor, we will be affected by COVID. So there are going to be some tough changes to be made. Be it a road here, maybe a fancy project here. We're going to have to make some tough decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Redina.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And unfortunately, the current public health crisis is obviously having a pretty substantial impact on our local budget. It's an issue that's made worse by, frankly, a broken state municipal finance system that has been shortchanging our city for years. One of the things that I think we need to do when we're talking about the budget is ensure what we're going to protect, right? And I think we need to make sure that we are not going to make cuts to our basic services, the things that make our city work each day for our residents. Those things need to be off the table. Those are the things that absolutely keep our city running, and are things that we need to protect as we look at the budget moving forward. I'm really interested and invested in some of the ideas that our interim city manager, Tom Crawford, has brought forward. That would be some of the smaller budget pieces that we could potentially cobble together into some bigger savings, things that wouldn't have as dramatic of an impact on the day-to-day life of our residents. Things that I believe the city council already approved, like postponing the deer call for a year to make sure that those savings go back into the budget, instituting a hiring freeze, making sure that any new recurring expenses are offset by recurring revenues. I've mentioned before things like reducing the frequency with which we mow city parks from every week to every other week. Voluntary furloughs that allow employees to voluntarily take leave. Those types of things can actually add up into some pretty sizable savings. And then I think we need to look at other things like creative ways about finding new sources of revenue without placing the additional financial burden onto the backs of lower and fixed income residents in the city. Growing our tax base by allowing things like transit-oriented development that would allow more housing to come into the city to address the needs of our low-income residents who need housing and workforce housing, and also allow us to expand our tax base. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Redina. Now on to the next question, starting with Mr. Brown. Most communities are becoming much more aware that racial bias is built into virtually every system in the United States. And while Ann Arbor takes pride in winning many Best City to Live in awards, it ranks poorly in income inequality and is identified as an economically segregated area. Please share examples of how City Council can identify and combat systemic racism in our community.
Peter, I've been saying this for a long time, and I hope you get this when I tell you this. I'm still waiting on my 40 acres and a mule. America has been trying to deal with racism since we fell on Plymouth Rock, or Plymouth Rock has fell on us, sir. You're talking about someone who had his tail kicked by the Ku Klux Klan when he was around 10 or 11 years old. So I'm not sure if you can come down and say, this is our racism plan, and put up a bunch of Black Lives Matter stickers and have a bunch of legislators come out and say, and run on the platform of racism. Because truly, the only time African Americans and people of color and people are of the lower sector of life, we hear from politicians are when there's an election and there's something to talk about. So if Ann Arbor really wants to step up to the plate, you need to have representation at the table. The chief is a great start, but I'd love to see a female city administrator. I would love to see a citywide search with the Rooney Rule for the next city administrator. I would like to see Tony Brown be the next city council person in Ward 3 to represent the people. That's a great start for me, and I rest my case. And you can find more on my website. And if you ever want to talk about race issues, feel free to email me, feel free to text me, but there's no way that I can put a solution to racial issues in a 1-minute conversation. And I hope we can do a little bit better next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Redina.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with Tony. I think this issue is a really big issue, and it's hard to fit it into a time frame where really we're looking more at sound bites. I will say that you bring up a really important point. While Ann Arbor as a whole is one of the most highly educated, healthy, and economically prosperous cities in Michigan, we know from the data that communities of color have not always shared in that distribution of wealth, educational attainment, or job growth. As you noted, our region is one of the worst in the nation in economic segregation and income inequality. There are dramatic life expectancy differences between white residents and residents of color, literacy gap between white students and African American students. And so I'm committed to supporting the work that our city and our county already started to invest in equity. I think that if we as a city value diversity and equity, we need to invest in it. And so I will fully support the One Community Equity Initiative to work with staff to ensure that we are enacting and incorporating equity into community services, programs, hiring practices, our service delivery model, and our interactions with the public and community partners. I've also called for the creation of a minority and women business liaison position to ensure that racial and gender equity exists in awarding city contracts, to dismantle some of the barriers that exist for women and people of color who own or establish new businesses here in Ann Arbor. And I would also like to see us do things like, I think this issue you have to bring up policing, which we've already talked about a little bit. I'd like to repeal and revisit some of the laws that we know have known racial bias. I think we need to expand our sensitivity and bias training in our police department and make sure that we're also enacting hiring practices that ensure that our city and our police departments reflect the diversity of the neighborhoods that they serve.
Thank you, Mr. Redina. And starting the next question with you again.
Mr. Redmond.
Sorry, do I get a?
Whoops, sorry, Mr. Redmond. I'm sorry. Yes, your turn.
Sure, thank you. This is an incredibly important question. As you stated in the question, most of our systems, if not all of our systems in the United States, have baked in biases against people of color, specifically Black people. So what I plan to do in concrete terms with the 3 main planks of my platform is center environmental justice around protecting our natural resources, but ensuring that the people of color and Indigenous people who have historically been disenfranchised and dumped on by private capital development and the fossil fuel industry have at least a seat at the table and have to bear less of the financial burden in our transition to a green future. In terms of housing, Ann Arbor is both economically segregated and becoming increasingly racially segregated. The current act, single-family zoning, has historically been used to exclude people of color, people of low income, and generally people that are considered riffraff by the upper class from living in specific neighborhoods. So I believe we should get rid of single-family zoning, and we should endeavor to invest in our public housing fund, make it non-means tested, make it available to people of all races, all income levels, all religions, all faiths, and lift up the most vulnerable in our community. And we should empower the Police Oversight Commission. Police, you've been hearing it all across the country at all of these rallies. The one in Ypsilanti was especially powerful, hearing from individual members of the community talking about the experiences they've had with police that have all been negative. So we have to stand up to the police union and empower our independent community police oversight commission to do their own investigation and ensure that biased and racist police officers don't just lose their job in Ann Arbor and get hired somewhere else. Thank you.
Hey, Peter,
Thank you,
I
Mr.
just want to say, I'm sorry. These guys don't really get it. You know what I mean? When it comes to that stuff. And it would be better if they would understand that not all black people are poor and need social programs. Just a little respect when we come here and talk about it. I thought I talked to him about it, but you can cut this part out if you have to, but we don't all need a handout. How about just bringing us together as people?
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Now on to the next question, beginning with Mr. Redina. Now that the City Council unanimously adopted the A20 carbon neutrality by 2030, what are the most important next steps the City Council should take to implement this plan?
Thank you. I think that's a really great question. I was really happy to see the A20 plan get adopted by the city. And obviously, this just means that we've created the work that needs to be done now. So the hard work is still ahead of us. I want to start by saying I have the utmost confidence in and respect for Dr. Missy Stoltz, our Office of Sustainability and Innovations, and the entire A20 team. They are leading the efforts on carbon neutrality here in the city. Obviously, this will have far-reaching implications across our entire city, but I have seen them at work in the community, and I am incredibly confident in the work that lies ahead with them leading this charge. I think we need to continue to adequately fund their office to ensure that they have the resources to do this work. And I think some of the things that we need to start tackling immediately, because they're going to take a long time, are things like bringing the state and the university on board as partners in this effort. There is no way that we're going to accomplish our goal of being carbon neutral by 2030 if they don't come to the table and participate as partners in this effort. So we need to begin working on them right now to bring them to the table, to see what challenges will exist for them, and to see how we can work together to make sure that we're all working toward the same goal. We're going to need, if we follow the plan as enacted, some legislation to pass in the state legislature to allow us to enact things like community choice aggregation so that we can start moving towards renewable energy sources and not simply shift our carbon footprint onto other communities. I think that we also have some things that are some smaller things here at the local level that we should do that could have a bigger impact. I would like to see expanding our compost service and look at year-round pickup. We need to permanently reestablish our local MRF and stop shipping recyclables 250 miles away to Cincinnati for processing. And I think we need to make sure that we're joining a new regional waste authority so that we are looking at the way that we're handling some of our waste. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Redina. Now, Mr. Redmond.
Sure. Sorry, I'll be quick. But before I begin, I would like to address a mischaracterization by candidate Brown. I'm not suggesting that public housing be for one specific group of people and we marginalize groups in housing. I am a democratic socialist, so I believe that workers of all races, of all religions are entitled to what they create. And in this case, if the private market is not doing enough to provide housing for anyone, for any reason, it is the government's role to step in. As for the A20 plan, what I would like to see is a feasibility study conducted to understand the ramifications of potentially creating a municipally owned energy utility. As one of my opponents said before, they might require all new buildings to include solar panels, which would be a huge burden on the people moving in, because they would also have to require batteries, because countries like Germany and other European nations have solved their climate change problem by allowing the energy grid to buy energy from individuals. And currently, DTE is not doing that and blocking that kind of legislation on a state level. So we have to stand up to this local monopoly. We have to be tough, and we have to figure out how Ann Arbor can take control of its own electricity if we really are going to try to be carbon neutral by 2030.
Thank you, Mr. Redmond. Mr. Brown.
Well, I'm with, I told Evan the last time we ran into each other, I like you a lot, brother. And I think he's spot on. We do need to get on our own grid. And if not, we need to figure out how to get it and where we can buy it at a cheap rate. That's first of all. But I'm going to stand strong with solar energy, because I'm not saying that you require it, but I'm saying that when you build something, the option needs to be there long term. There are a lot of ways that we're going to need to tackle this issue. And one of them would also be to encourage Spark, the Ann Arbor Spark. Whenever they do anything, it has to be A20 and climate change friendly. We have to attack it from the business point as well as the educational point. So I'm all about going to get it and doing our own. I'll leave it at that right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Now on to the next question, starting with Mr. Redmond. Over the last decade, the university's research, development, and tech transfer has created enormous job growth, while the private sector has built mostly student housing and luxury condos. There has been little to no supply of housing for the working class people making $30,000 to $60,000 per year, so it's no surprise that we have 84,000 commuters coming to town every day. What specific ideas do you support to address the lack of affordable and workforce housing, increased traffic congestion, and auto-driven environmental damage?
That is a huge question that's super important to me. And as we touched on earlier, Ann Arbor needs to take a greater role in providing that supply of housing, not just to the workforce, but also people experiencing homelessness, seniors that are having trouble aging in place. Extended that not just to the most needy, but extended that to everyone. By controlling the rent at these Ann Arbor built and city-owned future developments, we'll be able to house people and not break their bank. It's incredibly important to help house the workforce that work in Ann Arbor. As you mentioned, literally over 80,000 people. So when we talk about housing and we talk about potential PUDs, potentially increasing a zoning a little bit to get a handful of units, that's not enough. We need to take really big and bold actions. So as I previously stated, I believe that we should allow by right condominiums and duplexes to help with the supply problem. But also Ann Arbor, and a report that came out in May, is sitting on a potential thousands and thousands of units of affordable housing that just don't have the funding or the political will to be built yet. I will bring that political will to build those houses and housing units to the Ann Arbor City Council, but also I think that we have to look for funding mechanisms. And I know that it's a little scary right now to talk about taking out loans, but these projects are not a money drain. This is an investment. Even by charging a fraction of the rent as the market rate, by building all these units of houses, we'll be able to make a profit and be able to fund future development projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Redmond. Mr. Brown.
Does anyone remember the rent is too damn high guy? I'm just asking. Anyone old enough to remember that? The rent is out of control here in Ann Arbor, first of all. We first of all need to get that under control, but we need to ask ourselves, what do we really want in Ann Arbor? Do we want affordable housing, Are we looking for low income housing? I've never really been able to distinguish that because we're still owed a lot of affordable housing and we still haven't got there yet. But the key is get these zoning laws under control and get on board with where we want to be as a city, right? We need to really do some city council work, right? And do some commission work and do some planning work and get these zoning laws under control. That's the first thing we need to do, and start reaching across the aisle and putting egos aside and getting on board and stop approving developments that come through and destroy neighborhoods. And another thing we need to do is get the banks on board, because remember, at the end of the day, people who own their own homes do better than those who rent. We still have a lot of people who are out paying rent and not even building their credit score. We need to do the right thing. We need to tackle the zoning issue, figure out who we want to be as a city. If we want to be a luxury city with luxury townhomes everywhere, then so be it. But if you want to be the global diverse city that you say you want to be, start attacking these zoning laws, start getting people into home ownership. Pittsfield Village, neighborhoods like Evan was talking about earlier, it's time to put up or shut up. We need to reach across the aisle, get these commissions under control, get development under control, and start innovating.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Redina.
Yeah, thank you so much. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I believe that Ann Arbor is in the midst of a housing crisis. This is an issue that's really personal to me, and one that I understand firsthand. I was lucky enough to buy my house back in 2017, but my sister, who is a foster care social worker, simply cannot afford to live in Ann Arbor on her salary alone. So she currently lives with me. But I think it's unacceptable that so many of the hardworking people who come to Ann Arbor for work are forced to leave at the end of each day to live, raise their family, pay taxes, and retire elsewhere. So I think, unfortunately, too often our conversation around housing in the city is narrowly focused on the pros and cons of individual projects. So I think that if we want Ann Arbor to maintain its economic diversity and its stability, and to be accessible in the future for residents who work here, we need to commit to a more comprehensive approach to our housing. I'd like to see things like incentivizing inclusionary zoning practices, which would allow a share of all new construction projects to be affordable with people of low and moderate incomes, workforce housing, and then advocating for changes in state law that would empower Ann Arbor to make that standard practice. I think we need to insist that all new projects are mixed use, mixed income, and carbon neutral whenever possible, to also ensure that we're confronting global climate change and fulfilling our city's pledge to carbon neutrality. I want to incentivize innovative, affordable rental alternatives like accessory housing, tiny homes, co-op communities. And I think that we need to make sure that we're also looking at things like focusing new housing along our major transit corridors where folks have reliable access to amenities, public transportation options, and services. And I agree with my opponent, Tony, about the astronomical cost of rent here in the city. I also think that we need to immediately establish a renters commission and look at reestablishing the Ann Arbor Tenants Union.
Thank you, Mr. Redina. We're almost out of time. One last question before your closing comments, starting with Mr. Brown. You'll like this question. In canvassing your constituents, what is their most important concern? What are they concerned about? And I tell you loud and clear.
Great question, Peter. The conversations out here where I've been, from Easy Street over to Forest Brook, over in the Brayburn Circle, up in the Burns Park, it's humbling, because I grew up here. And I'm starting to run into people that I grew up with. I'm starting to run into their parents. And it's different on every side of town, believe it or not. Certain side of towns, it's, I want to be able to afford to go downtown and enjoy dinner and afford it on some. I want to be able to experience the Ann Arbor life, and I can't because I'm working 2 jobs just to pay rent on certain side of towns. And then there's the conversations where, well, I just don't know if Ann Arbor's right for a 75-year-old. It's getting tough. My pension's getting tough. The taxes are going up on the house. I've been through 2 recessions, so I'm hearing a lot of those things. And the thing is, these are people that I grew up with watching. These are people that were my mentors and people that I tried to pattern my work ethics after. So it's different issues. And then over here in Pittsfield, it's the roads, right? They're rolling through our roads on Pittsfield like it's I-96 or I-94, and then over in Brayburn Circle, the message is, why are we still living next to the dump, and then they're wanting to move Lockwood 2 somewhere near us. And is our water safe? So I can't just put it in one blanket. For me, my experience with Ann Arbor residents are a lot different because I grew up here. And this is my home, So my conversations are going to be a lot different than Evans and Travis. They're just going to get the political speech. But these are more homegrown speeches for me.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Redina.
Thank you. All over the community, though, I'm hearing things like making sure that we're maintaining and building our roads and infrastructure to be accessible and usable for residents, whether they're cycling, walking, driving, or utilizing public transit. I hear from a lot of people, as I expressed earlier in the evening, about the need for council to be more responsive and accessible to residents, and to hear the concerns of residents and actually address them rather than simply moving forward. And then I think we also have things that we've touched on all night tonight, things like affordability and climate change. All of these issues are incredibly important to residents all over our city, and I think it would be unfair to narrow it down to any one, because depending on what your experiences are in your neighborhood or in the part of the community that you live in, it may be slightly different. Your life experiences can change that as well. And so I think we've touched on a lot of those really important issues tonight, but my approach to this will be to continue, again, to be accessible and responsive to my residents, so that regardless what your individual concerns are, I'm hearing it and I want to address it, because I recognize that there's not any one thing that is overarchingly important to everyone, that everyone has needs that are important, and depending on what's going on, that can feel like it's life-altering in that moment. And so I'll strive to be accessible and transparent in my work, and consistently work to be having these conversations, not just through the course of a campaign, but if I am so lucky to be elected, into my service as well.
Thank you, Mr. Redina. And Mr. Redmond.
I have heard a lot of different issues expressed by people that I've canvassed with or had conversations with in the neighborhood. Some include affordability, climate change. A lot of it is, what is the role of city council? And in that way, I believe that there are a lot of people who have been alienated from the political process and what they can do to get involved with helping to improve their city in a political way. I'm not going to speculate on some of the reasons for that, but I think it is critical to bring more people into this political conversation so we're able to hear all of these different points of view. There is a big flooding problem in my neighborhood, and to the neighbors that I've talked to, there are people who are renters who are being priced out of town with increases to their rent. These are all people that don't have a voice right now. So something that I would like to work on if elected, even if I'm not elected, will be to organize these people and have a collective voice to either speak to city council and get things accomplished that will improve their material conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're now ready for the 90-second closing statements. We'll begin with Mr. Brown.
Sorry about that, guys. I'm having some technical difficulties. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. In 3, 2. My thanks to the league and the folks at home. This election is critical. Ann Arbor residents and their elected officials, we're going to face some tough decisions coming up here in the months and years. And our city is going to face a deficit. We're facing environmental changes and an opportunity for change. We've got to move forward together. Council members won't stop debating the issues, but we need the people on council to show respect for each other's opinions and ideas and come together. I'm running because I want to be part of a local government that helps the people, a government that solves problems creatively, and more than ever, we need council members to work together and work together strongly. And if there's anything you'd like to talk about or address any issues with me on any of these matters, feel free to reach out to me at my website at a2tonybrown.com or feel free to email me. Thank you.
Mr. Adina. Mr. Radina?
You guys, I cut my speech short because I blanked in and out. I couldn't see myself as well.
Can you hear me now? It was giving me the notice that I was being muted by the host, so I think we might have been muting over one another. Sorry about that. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for hosting tonight's forum and for giving us the opportunity to share our views and our values with the voters here in Ann Arbor. I hope it became clear tonight that I'm running for city council because I know that Ann Arbor is already a great place to live, but believe that we still have work to do if we want the Ann Arbor of tomorrow to continue being a prosperous, inclusive, and desirable place to live, work, raise your family, and eventually retire. The work ahead of us is critically important, and I know that I can't do it alone. That's why I'm asking you to join me in this effort. Please visit my website at travisradina.com. That's where you can learn more about me and my platform, reach out if you have more questions, and sign up to get involved in my campaign. If you're willing and able, I would welcome you to volunteer to help spread our message to your neighbors, to request a yard sign, or even make a small contribution to ensure that I have the resources to continue communicating with our neighbors between now and Election Day. Finally, and most importantly, I'm also asking for your vote in the Democratic primary on August 4th. Or if, like many of us, you plan on voting absentee even sooner than then. It would truly be my honor to serve as your next 3rd Ward council member. And if I'm elected, I look forward to working with each and every one of you to make our community an even better place to live. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Mr. Radina and Mr. Redmond.
Thanks again to the League of Women Voters for hosting this forum, especially now under these dangerous circumstances with COVID-19. I appreciate you continuing to host it in a safe way. And thanks to all of the watchers for seeking to be more informed. As a candidate, I'd like to ask you to vote for me and visit evanredmond.com for more information about my policy positions in my campaign. But I would like to use my closing statement to talk to everyone watching as a fellow resident of this community. 2020 is a turbulent year that shows no signs of getting calmer. It seems like we're living in a catastrophic moment where nothing will ever be okay or the same again. And it's easy to feel small and powerless, but I want everybody watching to know that you are more powerful than you think. Regardless of the outcome of this election, or any election for that matter, we have to keep fighting for change. We have to keep demanding more from our elected officials, and if we're to make any reforms that will affect everyone. The powers that be want us to fall into disarray, and they want us to give up, but I'm not going to do that. I'll continue to fight against climate change, for affordable housing, and against police brutality, and I hope you all will join me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Redmond. Thanks to all of you. I will now turn this over to Sally for the closing comments.
Thank you all for tonight for participating in the forum, and thanks. Will be streaming on your computer or smartphone. You can go to our website, lwvannarbor.org, access this taped forum. In addition, you can go to see residents to watch these forums. For additional information on candidates and ballot issues, you can go to a website called 411.org. In this site, you can enter your address and you will have access to all of the candidates and the ballot issues on your individual ballot. It contains information about the candidates and the ballot issues. So it's got a marvelous resource for information. The candidates answer questions and there's specific information on the ballot issues. So please use this resource. And it covers local, state, and federal candidates. And just as a reminder, you can now vote absentee. Everyone can vote absentee, and right up to the day of the election, you can register and vote. So remember, no matter how you do it,